Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the Samsung Galaxy Note 3 and see how this phone holds up in 2022. Now, I will definitely tell you this phone is a very interesting phone. I think it was very impactful, but I would not recommend buying this phone anymore, so please keep that in mind. I think it's very cool. I think it had, brought a lot to the table at that time, but please don't consider buying this phone unless you want to have a side device that you can go ahead and modify here and there. Then that makes a little bit more sense, but this would not be the first phone I would recommend buying by any means. But if you want to buy some phones I would recommend, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, looking on the front of the Samsung Galaxy Note 3, this phone came out in 2013, so it's approaching 9 years old right now. And what was very interesting was with the Samsung Galaxy Note 3, this was, I would say, a really big upgrade coming from the Samsung Galaxy Note 2. Samsung pretty much upgraded every single thing within this device, and they didn't really cut any corners. So going from a Note 3 or going from a Note 2 to a Note 3 was a massive upgrade, so much so in fact that going from a Note 3 to a Note 4 didn't even seem like that big of an upgrade. And then eventually, now the Note lineup is no more, but it's still cool that Samsung made a device like this that held up so well so many years later. On the front of this phone, we had a 5.7-inch Super AMOLED display, and it was a 1080p panel. Now the crazy thing is that nowadays, 5.7 inches is kind of small. That's kind of like a compact phone. You look at the Pixel 6a that had a 6.1-inch display, and for a lot of people, that was kind of a smaller phone. So 9 years ago, that was the biggest phone of all time. Nowadays, that is not really the case, so it's crazy that phones are becoming bigger and bigger, and we're becoming more adapted to it. Now, we do have that front-facing, camera there, which is really cool. We have a home button there as well, and the capacitive keys. So on the front, it doesn't really look that outdated. It definitely looks dated with the bezel and with the, home button and everything, but it's not really that crazy bad looking of a screen. I think it still looks pretty decent. The front phone pretty much is completely built out of plastic, so it doesn't really feel like the most premium thing. The glass obviously is on the front with the screen, but because the phone is primarily plastic, it doesn't feel that premium, and that is probably one of the biggest things and the biggest takeaways when we look at phones nowadays, especially with like the Galaxy S22s, the Z Folds that are coming out. Like those ones feel a lot more premium. But the other thing to keep in mind is that Samsung has brought back the plastic back on a few different phones like the S21 FE, the S21 we had last year, so it's totally understandable, but it is kind of one of those things to keep in mind as well. On the bottom we had a micro USB port, a headphone jack, but we also had that little USB 3.0 little flap at the bottom, which allowed us to have, things like fast charging on this phone too, which is really cool. And on the back, we do have a really interesting thing. We have a removable back that is plastic, we had the removable battery, and we had expandable storage on this phone too. Now, I just got done talking about the Galaxy Note 4, and these types of phones that had that type of peripherals where you can go ahead and remove the battery and so many other things like that, it's actually insane that Samsung actually ended up closing those things in. I love these phones because they had that type of capability, and if Samsung kept actually adding and implementing those changes, I feel like these phones could end up lasting forever. I mean, even with the Note 3, if you throw Android 12 on this thing, I feel like you could still end up getting a decent performing phone for how old this phone is and for how cheap it is. Of course, it's not going to be faster than even like a Galaxy S8, but it's still very interesting how it, kind of holds up kind of well in that area. Now, we do have the, single camera setup on the back too, which we'll go and hit on right now, but I will tell you the outside body of this phone, it still holds up fairly decently. When you remember that this thing is 9 years old and you can probably buy it for like $30, it's actually a decent looking phone. I mean, of course I wouldn't recommend buying it, but it's very interesting what type of phone Samsung made in 2013 and how it holds up 9 years later. And next year's going to be 10 years and it's going to be even crazier. Now, speaking about that camera setup, we had that single 13 megapixel camera and we had a 2 megapixel front facing camera. Now that camera on the back, it was a single, standard lens. So we did not have like that, ultra wide capability or telephoto lens. So we didn't have anything crazy like that, which is expected. I don't think there were too many phones in 2013 that had more than one sensor. In fact, I don't even think, multiple sensors started happening at a high level until like late 2015 and 2016. So I think with the Galaxy Note 3, that back camera, with it having 4K at 30, is really good in and of itself. And when you think about it, this phone came out in 2013. iPhones didn't even get 4K capability until 2015 with the iPhone, 6S. So it wasn't even until like a full 2 years later that iPhones ended up getting 4K capability. So you do have to kind of keep that in mind. This phone was kind of ahead in that area. The front camera 1080p as well. And again, there was a few years until iPhones could do 1080p on the front. Now this camera quality isn't bad, it's not great, it's kind of what you'd expect from a 2013 phone, but I remember when this phone came out in 2013, and this phone was the best, probably the best camera of that year. And when you keep in mind that really we only had like the Nexuses, we had the iPhones of that time too, and this phone, in my opinion, was definitely ahead of its time in that area, and there were so many camera features as well. So I'll definitely tell you the Note 3's camera holds up pretty decently for how old it is. It's not that good of a camera anymore, but for that time it was actually pretty interesting. Now in terms of software and how long this phone's going to last, this phone's already outdated, so there's really not much development going on in that area. However, as far as I know, there are some custom ROMs and stuff you can actually go ahead and install on this device if your phone supports it. So that is another really cool thing that you have the capability of doing. Again, I wouldn't really be the first one to recommend doing that kind of stuff, but if your phone supports it, I would recommend doing it. I wouldn't really recommend buying this phone, just for custom ROMing, but if you do and if you don't, I mean, it's up to you. That's kind of one thing to keep in mind as well. So in terms of the, software longevity, that kind of covers it up there. In terms of performance, this device internally had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 800 chipset inside and 3 gigabytes of RAM on every single model of this device. So I will start off with the RAM. That's actually not a massive amount of RAM, but you do have to keep in mind, back in 2013, 3 gigs of RAM was probably the most of most phones had at that point. And even when you look at something like, I still think there are some phones that have 4 gigabytes of RAM. I think of the Pixel 4a that had 6, but I think the Pixel 4 had 4 gigabytes of RAM, something along those lines. And again, that's not like the craziest amount of RAM for a 2019 phone, but for 2013 having 3, that's actually pretty interesting. I will say the performance nowadays is really limited with the ROM that's running inside of this thing. I think it's still TouchWiz. It did end off at Android Lollipop, so it didn't end off with, I think KitKat was probably the best version of Android of all time, followed by probably Android 10, I think it was pretty decent. But I do think with this version of software, totally understandable, and that's why it doesn't perform that well. It's because it has a heavy ROM inside of it, and it's an outdated phone for sure too, so there's that to keep in mind as well. I think with something like the Galaxy Note 3, it is standing the test of time in some ways, but it's exactly what you'd expect. It's not really going to perform that well. A lot of applications you can't really download and or install on it either, so that's another thing to keep in mind. And I think at the end of the day, the Galaxy Note 3 is up there with, I would say, one of the faster phones, probably 2013. I think the iPhone 5S was there as well. So with this phone, it's pretty much what you'd expect, like I mentioned before, and it's not really that great of a performing phone anymore either. So in terms of performance, that kind of covers it up there. In terms of battery life, this thing had a 3200 mAh battery inside of it, and again, that was another pretty big advantage of this phone. It had a really good sized battery with pretty decent battery life. But the other thing to keep in mind is actually with the removable battery. This phone, you could easily go ahead and remove the battery on this thing if you really wanted to, and that was another really big advantage. Just imagine removing the battery and expanding the storage that way. That is another really good advantage of this type of device. So when it comes down to it, obviously I don't think the Galaxy Note 3 is worth buying anymore. It practically makes absolutely no sense to even recommend buying this type of phone, but it is very interesting to see how Samsung made such a powerful device back in 2013 that a lot of the things that this phone had, we kind of went back. Things like the removable back and the removable battery and expandable storage, and for some people even the headphone jack, These things that these phones had back then are basically what we'd wish these manufacturers would bring and implement back in. But I'd still rather take a Galaxy S22 with a way faster phone, much longer longevity in front of it, way better cameras, way better display than something like this. But it would be interesting if they ever made like a Galaxy Note or an S20, series in general that brought back some of these fundamentals. So that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.